This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Livorno in 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today, we will be reading two articles from our paper, The International Communist Party. These two articles are For Class Antimilitarism and Oligarchy in the United States. Only workers' revolution can stop capital's onslaught. For Class Antimilitarism. Capitalism is endless reproduction of capital. Of capitalist production's purpose is capital itself. The increase of commodity production beyond any natural limit, at a breakneck speed, does not generate better welfare for mankind, but rather a series of catastrophic crises of overproduction that ravage social life over the entire planet. Of such crises, denied for decades by bourgeois theorists and believed unavoidable by authentic Marxism, the working class is the first victim, bearing the weight of unemployment, reduction of wages, and intensification of workloads. For capitalism, war is the necessary consequence of its periodical overproduction crisis. Capitalist war is therefore unavoidable. Only the enormous destructions provoked by the modern world wars allow capitalism to start anew its infernal cycle of reconstruction accumulation. Our era's imperialist wars, although invariably hidden behind humanitarian, democratic, pacifistic, defensive, anti-terrorist screens, are badly needed by the various capitalisms to share out the exhausted markets, to divide the continents among themselves. They are therefore wars for the conservation of capitalism, both on the economic plane and insofar as they provide, during the crisis, for the elimination of the part of the labor force that exceeds the reduced capacity of the system of production to employ it. As a matter of fact, they are immense slaughters of slaves that capital is not at that moment able to support. It's either war or revolution. There is no alternative route. The revolutionary communist attitude towards war is to denounce the idea of peace being compatible with capitalism as a tragic illusion, and to affirm that only the overthrowing of bourgeois power and the destruction of production relations founded on capital will free mankind from such a recurrent tragedy. On the line of Marx and Lenin, the party proclaims the tactics of class antimilitarism, of fraternization at the fronts, of revolutionary defeatism at the front and the rear, which aim to turn the war among states into a war between classes. Oligarchy in the United States. Only workers' revolution can stop capital's onslaught. Recently, the Trump administration has put forward a number of outrageous proposals, including the annexation of Canada and Greenland, two countries with rich Arctic shale oil and gas reserves. He has proposed to annex Gaza for a Middle East Riviera real estate project, while offering to broker a peace deal in Ukraine in exchange for direct control of rare earth mineral mines, amid a myriad of other hawkish threats directed at countries in the Western Hemisphere. While the liberals cry oligarchy and coup against democracy, there will be no return to normal, and the reason behind the madness has nothing to do with the bourgeois' chosen carnival barker, but is the product of the inevitable and world historical unfolding of capitalist economy whose highest stage is imperialism and fascism, a stage of human development which can only be brought to an end by international communist revolution. The United States, as with all other world capitalisms, is on the verge of a major economic catastrophe as a result of the global overproduction crisis. The exploding public and government debt, necessary for holding the world together after the 2008 financial crisis, is now at increasing risk of default year after year, something that has the potential to erupt into the largest economic cataclysm in world history. As rival imperialist powers also continue their ascent, the United States bourgeois is in desperate straits, finding fewer and fewer opportunities to simultaneously grow its profit margins and pay its debts. Behind the dominant faction of the bourgeoisie in Washington are the interests of big oil, big tech, and big auto. They claim to reassert the United States as an industrial and manufacturing powerhouse by kickstarting an artificial intelligence industrial explosion fueled by cheap oil and cheapened labor, leveraging the United States' new status as the largest producer of oil to corner the world energy markets and maintain the subordination of potential rival imperialism in the United States orbit through ensuring their continued dependence on American imports and exports, as they build a protectionist wall to cut out the Chinese companies that are hopelessly outcompeting United States corporations. To save America, through the Republican Party, they have united around the program of the far-right Heritage Foundation, which seeks to discard the prevailing norms of the domestic and international bourgeois legal order and alliance systems, downsizing the United States' administrative state, while promoting a litany of private-public projects aimed at renewing U.S. infrastructure and deepening nationalist and conformist indoctrination and terror, taking these desperate measures to attempt to ensure labor's total subordination. Big debts. At the height of U.S. power following the two world wars, the country was by far the world's largest creditor. Through institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, it financed the rebuilding of world capitalism through issuing massive loans and binding countries around the world to the U.S. dollar as its reserve currency. As capitalism has played its natural course, the United States is no longer the world's largest financier, but instead its largest debtor. On the second day of Trump's second term in office, the United States reached its $36.1 trillion annual borrowing ceiling. The ceiling forced the Treasury Department to take extraordinary measures, which are expected to hold the government over until March 14th, in order to continue U.S. expense payments and avoid defaulting on government loans. However, it appears the Congress will squabble until the last moment to finalize a plan, once again risking default. According to the country's largest hedge fund founder, Ray Dalio, in early February, the United States is currently in a death spiral of debt that could lead to an economic heart attack. The potential for U.S. default on its loans has increased dramatically in recent years, something that, if it were to happen, could trigger an economic cataclysm, global recession, frozen credit markets, plunging stock markets, and mass worldwide layoffs. According to the Treasury Department, as of February 5th, in only 1 month's time, already 60% of the department's debt cap measures had been exhausted, having only $133 billion left of the $338 billion authorized. The United States is currently in $35 trillion worth of debt, and the current proposed Republican budget would add $4 trillion more to the debt. With a current value of around $28 trillion, the United States Treasury market is the world's largest bond market and is crucial to the United States' government ability to finance itself and maintain stability of global financial markets. In 2013, the country's debt-to-GDP ratio surpassed 100%. In 2023, it hit unprecedented levels of 123%. Thus, with each passing year, it becomes less and less likely the United States will actually be able to pay it back. In fact, spending increased 50% between 2019 and 2021 due to pandemic tax cuts, stimulus programs, increased spending, and decreased tax revenues resulting from widespread unemployment. Government debt is accruing by issuing U.S. Treasury bonds, which are purchased on a market by foreign countries and private investors that buy in expectation consistent and stable returns. However, if the government is unable to service their debt payments, the whole system implodes. As the current administration lobbies Congress to remove the debt ceiling completely while maintaining large tax cuts, it is unlikely that the overall debt-to-GDP ratio will close anytime soon, even with significant spending cuts, thus only adding to the growing uncertainty and potential of a major financial crisis. According to the Standard & Poor's S&P, in 2024, corporate bankruptcies hit their largest level since the peak following the 2008 financial crisis in 2010, with over 694 filings in 2024, accompanied with large increases in delinquency rates on loan repayments. The retail sector, hit with consumer budgets tightening due to inflation, saw 108 companies file for bankruptcies, following industrial and healthcare industries with 88 and 65 firms respectively. Only 30 companies that filed for bankruptcy had more than $1 billion in liabilities, including big names such as Party City, Spirit Airlines, and Red Lobster. Credit-rated non-financial U.S. companies held a record of $8.45 trillion worth of debt in 2024. Inflation remains a lingering risk that could erode consumers' buying power and long-term corporate bond returns, and is likely to increase with more tariffs. Ahead of Trump's victory, Japanese investors offloaded a record $61.9 billion of the securities in the 3 months ending September 30th, according to data from the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Funds in China also sold off $51.3 billion during the same period, the second biggest sum on record. Japan and China still owe $1.02 trillion and $731 billion worth of treasuries respectively, underscoring their power over the U.S. debt market. However, the bond market has been in a free fall since the election, only flatlining in recent days. The economic reality of the American bourgeois state is that it must service its growing debt. Financially, it has very little room to maneuver without risking facilitating a global economic meltdown, potentially unlike what has ever been experienced in world history. Thus, the fascistic orgy taking place in the White House is a desperate attempt by the American big bourgeoisie to avoid the existential fires mounting all around the capitalist system, which is on the verge of economic cataclysm. While they claim to be stripping down the government of non-essential functions in an alleged attempt to lower the national debt, their actual proposals only enlarge the debt by increasing budgets for lucrative government contracts and retaining $4.5 trillion in tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, while squeezing the working class for every drop of surplus possible through increasing taxes on consumers in the forms of tariffs, rising consumer cost, and repression of wages amid increasing demands for repayment on private debts such as student loans. As the rapidly enlarging national debt becomes more and more insurmountable, making any new initiative on the part of the government increasingly financially risky, the grand vision to save America via an economic autarky built on hardline tariffs, large-scale public works projects, fueled by territorial conquests abroad under a renewed manifest destiny, have so far fallen flat, with Mexican and Canadian tariffs having to be canceled due to poor stock market response. Despite the promise of lowering inflation, the administration proves itself unable and uninterested in reducing the price of consumer goods such as eggs, as its trade war policies will only lead to rising prices. On the coattails of a campaign jam-packed with fevered dreams of a new utopian American Reich, the reality is that 3 weeks into the new administration and the government can barely only keep the lights on. However, the government now openly states that the average American must endure some pain in expectation of future prosperity and America becoming a rich country again. Thus, to ward off the impending economic apocalypse, the dominant section of the bourgeois put their hopes in reorganizing the economy around an industrial and manufacturing boom led by a massive artificial intelligence infrastructural expansion powered by an abundance of cheap energy resources. Big Tech and the AI coup. As we have pointed out, the debt-to-GDP ratio gap in the United States has continued to grow year after year. Likewise, the U.S. GDP has in recent decades averaged to around 2 to 3% growth annually, about half the rate of countries such as India and China. Thus, the United States economy must eventually close this gap or face its demise. Major financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs have pointed to AI as the solution to increase U.S. GDP growth, eventually increasing it to upwards of 7% annually by vastly increasing average worker productivity by automating an estimated 25% of work tasks and generating productivity growth by 1.5 percentage points annually. According to Goldman Sachs, assuming workers are not permanently replaced by automation and there's capital to support the increase in productivity, the increase in productivity could boost long-run worldwide GDP by as much as 15%. Executives anticipate a small impact from AI on activity and hiring needs in the next 1 to 3 years, but a much larger impact in the next 3 to 10 years. Sachs further notes that information and communication technology (ICT) investment has already been the main driver of productivity growth in major economies over the last 20 to 30 years. While the underlying productivity growth has been slowing, they say that research suggests that growth in total factor productivity tends to slow over time as countries developed, except during rare regime shifts such as those triggered by the First and Second Industrial Revolutions. The global artificial intelligence market size was estimated at $196.63 billion USD in 2023, and is projected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 36.6% from 2024 to 2030. AI has proven to be a significant element of the upcoming digital era. Tech giants like Amazon.com Inc., Google LLC, Apple Inc., Facebook, International Business Machines Corporation, and Microsoft are investing significantly in research and development of AI, thus increasing the artificial intelligence market cap. The AI market is also characterized by a high level of merger and acquisition activity by the leading players. This is due to several factors, including the desire to gain access to new AI technologies and talent, the need to consolidate in a rapidly growing market, and increasing military strategic importance of AI. This industry has also been subject to increasing regulatory scrutiny due to concerns about the potential negative impacts of AI, such as algorithmic bias, privacy violations, and job displacement. As a result, governments around the world have begun developing regulations to govern the development and use of AI, angering many of the tech oligarchs who now wish to dispense of these troublesome and foolish employees. To move the United States forward as a leader in the anticipated AI technological revolution, a massive $500 billion AI infrastructure initiative called the Stargate Project has been proposed by OpenAI, Oracle, SoftBank, and an Abu Dhabi-based investment fund called MGX, which will open massive data centers around the United States to massively expand AI. Oracle said in a statement, the project aims to support the re-industrialization of the United States, providing 100,000 jobs and boosting compatibilities to protect the national security of America and its allies. According to Fortune, the joint venture will invest an initial $100 billion of private capital to fund U.S. AI infrastructure, with a further $400 billion expected over the next 4 years. Trump said he would help with other emergency declarations to get more AI infrastructure off the ground, citing the need to keep AI development in the United States. He's expected to issue a spate of executive orders to ensure new data centers built in connection with the investment will have enough energy. According to Technology Review, much of the groundwork for this project was laid in 2024, when OpenAI increased its lobbying spending sevenfold and AI companies started pushing for policies that were less about controlling problems like deepfakes and misinformation, and more about securing more energy. The amount of energy required for the most advanced AI systems could reach unforeseen levels. For example, Microsoft's planned Stargate AI supercomputer data center alone may generate as much as 4 to 6 gigawatts of power, almost the equivalent to the power needs of a large city such as New York. According to the Data Center Dynamics, in the last 3 months, Exxon and Chevron, the 2 largest oil and gas companies in the United States, announced plans to develop gas-fired power plants to serve the data center market, citing AI power demands as the primary driving force, in addition to several new facilities that have already been built last year to service AI demand. The growth of the AI sector led global market intelligence agency S&P Global to project last year that demand for natural gas to support data centers could reach up to 3 billion cubic feet per day, or BCF/D, by 2030. According to Midstream Energy and Refining Managing Director Michael Grand, it's faster to power data centers with gas than to wait for emerging clean energy technologies. Despite the anticipated growth, Chinese innovation once again threatens U.S. capital. Last month, a small Chinese company unveiled a new AI technology called DeepSeek that has thrown big tech in the United States into a panic, jeopardizing their plans for a massive economic overhaul. DeepSeek is a new AI program which operates at approximately 1/10 the energy costs of current AI technologies in the United States. With the release of its V3 model in December, which only costs $5.6 million for its final training run and $2.78 million GPU hours to train. For comparison, Meta's Llama 3.1, despite using newer, more efficient chips, takes about 30.8 million GPU hours to train. NVIDIA, whose chips enable all these technologies, saw its stock price plummet by $600 billion on news that DeepSeek's version 3 only needed 2,000 chips to train, compared to the 16,000 chips or more needed by its competitors. While DeepSeek has not reduced demand, it has sent Silicon Valley into a mad rush to advance their plans at an even more rapid pace to keep up with the competition. As such, the need for cheap oil to fuel the AI boom necessary for U.S. economic growth, U.S. capital must rapidly move forward plans to grow its energy production. Big Oil, the past. The oil industry has played a central role in the machinations of American imperialism today as ever before. The expansion of the oil industry is crucial for fueling the anticipated AI boom and industrial expansion the bourgeois desperately need in an attempt to avoid getting shoved off their fiscal cliff, while it is also a necessary element in the extension and maintenance of the United States' protectionist wall against China by providing cheap oil to ward off investment in electronic vehicles, infrastructure, and supply chains. Ultimately, for capital's accumulation, deals with Russia must be struck and securing the Arctic for the United States' imperialism must be advanced. A fact unknown to most Americans is that in 2015, the United States became the largest producer of oil on Earth as a result of the new technologies and innovative methods of horizontal high-pressure hydraulic fracturing to drill for oil, known as fracking. Thus, in 2016, the United States lifted its decades-long ban on oil exports that were put in place after the 1973 oil crisis. For decades, the United States was addicted to foreign oil, as George W. Bush used to say, totally dependent on heavy crude oil imports. Prior to the fracking explosion, United States oil production peaked at 9.6 million BD in 1970, annual United States crude oil production flattened, and then generally declined for decades to a low of 5 million BD in 2008. By 1972, 83% of American oil imports came from the Middle East. The energy insecurity of the United States economy was first exposed during the 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC countries issued an embargo on oil sales to the United States. At the time, OPEC's share of the world oil trade was 75%. It resulted in fuel shortages, forcing a rationing of gasoline and skyrocketing prices. Before the embargo, a barrel of oil traded for around $2.90, which quadrupled to $11.65 per barrel by January 1974. The oil embargo was the result of the Middle Eastern countries retaliating against the United States for its military aid to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, which fought against Egypt and Syria. The crisis triggered a major shock in the United States bourgeois, who understood that their empire, built on fossil fuel-powered aircraft carriers and automobile sales, had a major Achilles heel. Thus, for decades after 1973, the focus of United States imperial foreign policy was organized around subordinating OPEC countries in the Middle East and working towards oil independence. Thus, it is no coincidence that Hamas deliberately chose the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War to launch its assault into Gaza last year on the eve of the ascendancy of the United States as a contender petrol state. In 2009, the rise of the fracking industry led to an economic boom, which ultimately enabled the United States economy to quickly recover from the 2008 financial crisis. The development of horizontal drilling fracking methods created a groundswell of small independent frackers, who, through various contracting agencies that brought the technological expertise, set up fracking operations on their land. The Drill Baby Drill movement aggressively pushed to lift government regulations that prevented the extension of fracking throughout the 2010s and opened up public lands to oil extraction. Over the years, these small proprietary operations were bought out and consolidated into the major oil corporations in the United States, a process which has rapidly played out over the last decade. By 2015, the United States became the largest producer of crude oil in the world due to continued expansion in fracking, producing 9.42 million barrels per day, BD. By 2023, 64% of the United States crude oil production came from hydraulic fracturing and production averaging 12.9 million barrels per day, far outstripping domestic demand. As the production of crude rapidly increased, it led to a glut of fracked sweet crude oil in the United States market that was unable to be refined at United States refineries equipped to process foreign imported heavy crude, and a glut of liquefied natural gas also emerged. As a result, in 2016, the United States rescinded its decades-long policy of banning oil exports to begin moving this surplus onto international markets. Despite opening up exports, the United States oil industry continues to face an overproduction crisis due to limited consumption and market share. Any increase in production without a rise in price would only diminish profits. Correspondingly, the vast surplus forced United States capital to compete with other imperialist powers for control of foreign export oil markets. As fracked United States oil costs more to produce and is thus already sold at a higher price, it wasn't able to break into major export markets outside of North America until after the February 2022 war in Ukraine, when Russian crude oil and LNG was sanctioned in Europe. The United States, a rising petrol state and the OPEC cartel. In 2016, in response to dramatically falling oil prices due to United States fracked oil output on global export markets, Russia, Mexico, and other oil producers that were not previously part of the OPEC alliance joined to form OPEC+. Within OPEC+, oil production between the countries is limited to mitigate the growing global overproduction crisis, which could burst out in a crash unless carefully contained due to an overabundance of commodities on the global market that leads to declining prices. Thus, the cartel works to keep prices artificially high through limiting and reducing international production. However, these methods put a straitjacket on the productive forces, which over time leads to intensifying contradictions between producers. As increased oil production capacities and facilities spread to new countries across the world, reactivation of decommissioned installations, and the incorporation of new production zones, the price of oil on the global market continues to experience a downward pressure and faces declining profitability. For a time, the United States followed the OPEC strategy. However, it has increasingly sought to cut into their markets due to overproduction. Because of its diversified economy, it can run more risk of increased production and lower price. This forces OPEC nations to reduce production and thus lose market share. However, too low of a price for too long would also destroy the United States oil industry. Fracked crude oil is more costly to produce, so while the United States may aim to cut into other OPEC markets, it ultimately must play a balance of controlling global oil supply to maintain profitability. Thus, it too must ultimately seek to make allies amongst other elements in the cartel if it wishes to dominate the market and steal other smaller players' market share. So we can see why the bourgeois is keen to open lines of communication with Russia once again. Many OPEC nations require relatively high oil prices, often above 60 to 70 per barrel, to balance their budgets. OPEC countries' government budgets tend to be from 30 to 90% reliant upon oil revenues. 60 to 70% of Saudi Arabia's budget, 90% of Venezuela's, 40 to 50% of Russia's government revenue. When oil prices fall, OPEC countries experience significant declines in government revenue, leading to budget deficits and economic instability. Unlike the United States, many OPEC members lack diversified economies, making them more vulnerable to prolonged periods of low oil prices. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, between 2016 and 2025, OPEC Plus global market share has declined from 53% to 46%, while the United States has grown from essentially a complete outsider to hold 9.1% market share. Today, many OPEC countries can no longer afford to reduce prices further without vastly reducing returns and getting completely cut out of their existing markets. So, to succeed in the oil market, it requires a degree of cartelizing, while to break into it, one must act as a bit of a rogue. So we can understand how the United States' shifting geopolitical alliances under Trump are ultimately guided by these determining and impersonal economic realities. The future. Oil and the Ukraine war. In 2023, the United States became the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and the fourth largest exporter of crude oil, followed by Canada in fifth place, and of whom approximately 97% of its crude oil exports go to the United States. The two are sandwiched between OPEC Plus countries, with Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iraq respectively in the top three positions. Inversely, the United States exports about 10% of its oil to each Mexico, China, Canada, the Netherlands, and South Korea, with the remaining exported to 142 other countries. Following the war in Ukraine in 2022, the United States market share of crude oil imports in Europe rose to 18%, overtaking Russia as the number one supplier as sanctions took place. Russia's share of Europe's natural gas imports had fallen sharply, from 31% in the first quarter of 2022 to nearly 19% by the end of the year. That has made the United States Europe's second biggest supplier of gas, with nearly 20% share behind Norway. 3 years into the Ukraine war, as the two armies slaughtered each other for years, spilling countless soldiers' blood, Russian oil on the world markets flowed mostly uninterrupted. Russia withstood numerous weak sanctions, including the G7 mandating a $60 per barrel price cap on its oil sales. The United States sanctions have not aimed to completely stop Russian international exports, despite its embargo to U.S. markets in fear of skyrocketing global oil prices. Despite these sanctions in 2024, the European Union imported a record 16.5 million metric tons of LNG from Russia, surpassing the 15.2 million in 2023. Nevertheless, European Union countries led by Germany have done much to remove off of their Russian oil and gas. Between early 2022 and the end of 2023, the EU slashed its imports of Russian fossil fuels by 94%, from 16 billion per month to around 1 billion per month. By November 2024, the United States had refilled its 400 million barrel strategic oil reserves, which it had mostly depleted in 2022, to keep prices low in the face of a surge after the Russian fuel embargo. Thus, in January 2025, the Biden administration felt confident to issue a new round of sanctions, which led to rising prices of Russian oil. Within a few days, Russian oil in the Indian and Chinese market increased 20% in price. As a result, India has decided to move away from Russian imports in favor of United States imports. The spike in shipping price was a result of aggressive pushing in the final days of the Biden administration to intensify sanctions against Russian and Iranian tanker shadow fleets operating under flags of convenience. Also, in January, Ukraine refused to renew the long-standing contract with Russia, which allowed oil and natural gas to flow through its territories amid an intensified drone bombing campaign targeting Russian refiners that has reduced their output by 10 to 20%. Facing the complete loss of access to European markets and the loss of its access to Indian oil markets, which have accounted for approximately 30% of its oil revenues, alongside a growing deficit of over $100 billion since the war began, Russia faces a potential economic crisis. Despite the Trump administration's flattering tone towards Putin, behind the scenes the administration has threatened harder sanctions from those already initiated in the last days of the Biden administration. According to recent statements by the Trump administration envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, at the Munich Security Conference on February 15th, so what does Russian President Vladimir Putin have to give up? Well, maybe he'll give up his oil revenue, and we'll force him to do it, because what you do is start employing sanctions that break the economic back. While Russia has been winning the military conflict in Ukraine on the ground, it appears that the United States is beginning to win the larger economic war on Russian oil, as Trump is set to meet with Putin to talk terms in Saudi Arabia in the coming days. The three Petrol states will likely also hash out a deal for carving up the world's oil markets in a post-Ukraine war world. Meanwhile, the offensive comments of J.D. Vance, Trump's vice president, at the recent Munich Security Conference have outraged and stirred the European states up enough to rally around Zelensky, who is now calling for the creation of a European army, as the United Kingdom pledges to send troops to Ukraine if necessary, and the continental states plan to gather to discuss increasing defense spending. Despite the cries of the liberal European democracies against the rise of American fascism, they ultimately act like obedient dogs and do just what the fascists were cajoling them to do: arm yourselves for war. Of course, this will mean no chance of them returning for cheap Russian oil and no real chance of a revitalization of the German economy. However, they will continue to find a willing purveyor of oil in the United States despite all of the ruffled feathers. Thus, we can see that the economic and political sands are shifting all over the world. The United States is dividing and conquering the world to maintain its dominance around its oil economy, as its primary imperialist rival, China, works to leave fossil fuels behind. The United States can then, once again, shift its military weight to other theaters within the global buildup to the next inter-imperialist war. The battle for the Arctic. In the first few weeks of the Trump presidency, he announced the American big bourgeois ambition for the conquest of Greenland and the annexation of Canada. Taking into consideration that the United States is functioning as an imperialist petrol state due to its new role as a petroleum exporter, we can understand why it is important for the United States capital to gain control of these areas rich in oil and rare earth mineral resources. The United States Energy Information Administration expects U.S. crude oil production to peak in 2030, while OPEC production is expected to continue rising through 2050. Thus, for the United States to maintain its competitive advantage, it must continue to expand its operations. As we have already pointed to the extensive reliance of the Canadian economy on both United States oil imports and exports, it is clear why annexation of Canada would be in the economic advantage for the forces of U.S. imperialism. Likewise, an analysis by the United States Geological Survey suggests that Greenland contains approximately 31,400 million barrels of oil and other fuels, including around 148 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. As global warming has commenced, the receding of the Arctic ice caps has made the Arctic area a zone of increasing economic and strategic significance. The climate reality has led the opening up of Canada's Northwest Passage and Russia's Northern Sea route. These pathways could significantly shorten shipping time by 30 to 50% between Asia, Europe, and North America. The area is expected to have 13% of undiscovered global oil reserves and 30% of natural gas reserves, along with an abundance of rare earth minerals. Greenland is rich in untapped rare earth elements such as dysprosium, neodymium, europium, and yttrium. All important materials for AI hardware, quantum computing technologies, renewable energy systems, and advanced defense equipment. The Tanbreeze project alone contains an estimated 28 million tons of rare earth oxides, nearly 30% being heavy rare earth elements. These resources could significantly reduce U.S. reliance on China, which currently controls over 80% of global rare earth element production. Currently, the Arctic is becoming a hotly contested zone for world imperialism. Russia, which controls 53% of the Arctic coastline, has heavily militarized its territories with air bases and naval forces, while China has declared itself a near-Arctic state to justify growing investments in Greenland's mining sector. It also holds substantial stakes in major Russian Arctic LNG projects. By acquiring Canada and Greenland, the United States would secure dominance over these resources and routes while acting against Russian and Chinese ambitions. Big Auto: Mexico and Chinese electric vehicles. China's EV, or electric vehicle, market has grown exponentially over the past decade. In 2020, EVs accounted for about 5 to 6% of new car sales, but this figure has surged to over 30% in just a few years. China's share of the global electric vehicle market in 2024 is expected to be around 76%. China is the world's largest exporter of battery cells, cathodes, and anodes. In February 2024, Chinese manufacturers held 3 of the top 5 spots for global market share. In Q4 of 2023, Chinese automaker BYD sold more electric vehicles than Tesla. Electric cars account for 20% of total global car sales in 2024. According to Goldman Sachs, China will also have the capacity to produce something close to 25 million electronic vehicles by late 2025, as production is currently increasing by close to 4 million cars a year, and Chinese firms continue to invest heavily. China now has a capacity to supply over half the global market for cars, which is typically around 90 million cars a year. China currently has the capacity to produce over 2 times its own domestic demand and is adding to that capacity quickly thanks to the rapid expansion of its electric vehicle sector. It thus has almost unlimited potential capacity to export. China has gone from exporting 1 million low-end cars a year in 2020 to exporting 6 million cars a year in 2024. Thus, while we have so far explored the imperialist conflicts the United States is entering into as it emerges a dominant petrol exporter and begins conflicting with China around the emerging AI and tech markets, we can now see the lines of the conflict around the automobile export industry. For China, it has built an industry around supply chain which gives it an advantage due to its control of 80% of the world's rare earth mineral deposits. For the United States, its role as the world's largest producer of oil means that its automotive industry is tied to its access to cheap petrol. The ascendancy of United States capital's world domination was built on the back of its auto industry in the post-war era. It was an industry led in its early days by the national hero Henry Ford, an open and notorious supporter of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party. Today, we have Elon Musk filling in those shoes. The American auto industry faces a new existential challenge from the rising Chinese auto industry that dominates the globe's electric vehicle markets and faces a new potential competitor in Mexico. As a result of the tariff war on China, many companies have moved their production centers to Mexico to access relatively cheap, exploitable labor in close proximity to the United States consumer markets. Over the years, the Mexican economy has rapidly industrialized and grown to become the largest producer of exported goods to the United States, comprising 13% of all imports, displacing China last year, who held that position for nearly half a century. However, the Mexican economy is highly dependent upon exports to the United States, which comprise 83% of its overall export economy, making it highly vulnerable to United States imposed tariffs, a fact which gives the United States serious leverage over Mexico in negotiating terms of trade deals. Likewise, Mexico and Canada are the two largest export markets in the world for declining United States automotive industry. United States automakers, such as Ford, GM, and Stellantis, collectively hold a 20 to 25% market share of new vehicle sales in Mexico. A key development in the Mexican economy has been the move of auto manufacturers across the world to locate their factories in the country. A handful of cities, such as San Luis Potosi, have become little Detroits, hosting many international car companies such as BMW, Volkswagens, Audis, Mercedes-Benz, Fords, Nissans, and Chevrolets. In the first 9 months of 2024, Mexican factories produced more than 3 million vehicles, of which 2 million were exported to the United States. In 2022, Mexico produced approximately 3.5 million vehicles, making it the sixth largest producer globally. Mexico exported around 2.8 million vehicles in 2022, accounting for 80% of its total production. The growing standards of living of Mexican workers has also led to a large internal consumer market for automobiles in which the imperialist powers now struggle for control. The automotive consumer market in Mexico is dominated by imports of cheap Chinese vehicles. China has positioned itself as the main car supplier in Mexico, with exports reaching $4.6 billion in 2023, according to data from Mexico's Secretariat of Economy. This growth was driven by increased demand for its affordable electric vehicles, according to data from automakers and research firm Mark Lin. The Chinese company, BYD, wants to sell 100,000 EVs in Mexico in 2025, and it plans to build a massive new manufacturing plant in Mexico this year. Elon Musk, for years, had planned to invest billions with the development of the EV Gigafactory in Mexico. However, recently, he has put his plans on hold, leveraging for more suitable deals. In response to early tariff threats, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, put forward plans for Mexico to develop their own supply chains and begin producing their own domestically produced electronic vehicles to compete on global markets. Thus, as international manufacturing companies have moved to Mexico to access cheap labor, it is now developing into a rival industrial power, just as has happened with China. For United States capital, it wishes to both repel Chinese competition within Mexican markets and subordinate the Mexican economy to a subservient role within its new industrial reorganization and reshored supply chain. Moving in suit with the United States this summer, Canada announced it would implement a 100% tariff on electronic cars and a 25% levy on steel and aluminum from China, which is, broadly, in line with levels proposed by the former Biden administration, making Canada currently the only other country to completely align with the United States on its trade policies with China. Bourgeois leaders in both countries have expressed dissatisfaction with Mexico's ties to China and its lack of fully committing to the trade war. For a time, Mexico had considered joining the BRICS Alternative Economic Alliance to the G7 and is presently a part of the OPEC Plus alliance. A large Mexican tariff on Chinese EV would clear out the far and away largest competition for the United States auto manufacturers in the Mexican market. While Mexico has followed along by imposing some tariffs on steel production, they have not complied to the extent that satisfies United States capital's desire for more domination of its markets. Long before the second Trump presidency, the NAFTA-era cooperation between Mexico and the other two North American states began to erode. In a reversal of previous administrations who attempted to present a reformed face to the United States imperialism in Latin America, during Trump's last administration, he began to openly claim the Monroe Doctrine while initiating a campaign to push China out of Latin America. The recent renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America is only a testament to that ambition. In the last decade, China has become the main trading partner of most South American countries. Despite this, attempts to keep China out of the region have been long-standing. Over half of the countries that still recognize the ROC, and thus remain trade partners with the United States and Taiwan instead of PRC, are located in Latin America. The return of the vengeful eye of the United States imperialism to Latin America also has the focus of curtailing developing regional imperialist blocs such as the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, founded by Hugo Chávez's Venezuela to include many Bolivia, Cuba, Dominica, Nicaragua, and others. Capital's new axis. Today's threats of military conquests targeting yesterday's allies are all a part of a new global divide being carved up by the preeminent imperialist powers. As the rising capitalisms in the East begin to put to rest any hope of the United States permanently preserving its status as the sole hegemonic imperialism, the old Washington consensus has disappeared. The old faction of neoliberal and neoconservative within the bourgeois parties received its final kick in the ass with the defeat of Kamala Harris in 2024. The commercial policies of a global free market, acceptable when the United States was the hegemonic power, are now blown away amidst the expanding trade wars. The apparent multilateralism between the United States and its allies is replaced with a multipolar world of competing rivals and subject states. The hypocritical, international liberal, rules-based order, which served as justification for countless wars since the end of the last great imperialist conflict, is replaced with an open and shameless embrace of a return to the Monroe Doctrine. The theater of high-minded bourgeois legality dropped for the simple assertion of might as right to justify territorial conquests. All the once great liberal democracies are failing one by one. As regional capitals across the world become imperialist competitors and the looming overproduction crisis afflict almost all sectors, the impending financial catastrophe, which will set the stage for the complete destruction of the bourgeois world order, becomes increasingly unavoidable. The current economic and existential crisis facing the American bourgeois as a result of the overproduction crisis, the resulting exploding national debts, its declining competitiveness in its automobile, tech, and manufacturing sectors, combined with its newfound rise as a major petroleum exporter amid the inevitable growing concentration of the productive forces into a smaller and smaller number of large conglomerates, these representatives of the big bourgeoisie have asserted their dominance at the head of the pack of wolves, and today they must execute a rapid readjustment to many of its states' long-established foreign policies and legal norms to save America, which really means preserving the ability of their national capital to accumulate. It is the economic laws of capital accumulation which ultimately shape and determine the changing sands of political and social forms. At this stage of world imperialism, fascism, democracy's rude counterpart becomes inevitable. Today, the exploding contradictions in capital have pushed the two bourgeois parties into an increasingly sectarian struggle which paralyzes the legislature. As big capital consolidates around the Republican Party, the old neoconservative Republicans increasingly jump ship to the Democratic camp or capitulate. As the petty bourgeois flood into the Democrats, inflamed from the bold moves of the big bourgeois to push them aside, the Social Democratic wing takes lead in performing the role of opposition. However, to continue to accumulate, big capital's needs must be put above all others, and the rest of the bourgeois must fall in line or be forcefully subordinated. To break through the legislative stalemate, the old government system created to separate and balance powers between competing interests must be tossed aside and a no longer veiled dictatorship of capital established. Yet, as our party demonstrated in our 1922 report on fascism, written upon its rise in Italy, it is only a passing form of bourgeois democracy itself, completely capitalist and completely subject to the same laws of capitalist crisis, which will eventually give rise to the return of the worldwide communist movement, culminating in the end of the bourgeois phase of history at the hands of the dictatorship of the proletariat led by its International Communist Party.